Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm AYK Swedish Whiskey Girl, and today we're gonna talk a little bit about how to get started with drinking whiskey. This is of course quite a tricky subject and it's gonna be different for everyone. But I thought I'd share a bit about how I kind of look on it and some tips and tricks about how you can kind of achieve this. Of course, you don't have to like whiskey. If you really want to get into it and you're curious about it, learning about it is of course a really good step. And I'm sure I'm going to forget to mention certain things, but let's see if I can think of a few things at least. So one of the things is of course what end of the whiskey spectrum you're going to start. Bourbon's its own thing, you have Irish whiskey, you have Scotch whiskey, and then of course whiskies from all over the world. And I know already it seems like quite an extensive universe, just this wonderful world of whiskey. And of course, if you want to learn more about the different types of Scotch there is and what Scotch whiskey actually is, check out my video on what is Scotch and that will explain a little bit more about that to you. But I would say, if you're starting out with whiskey, there's different ways of going about it. Just kind of getting used to whiskey is one of the biggest steps you kind of have to overcome in the kind of progress to learning to like it. I didn't like it at all when I just got started, but I got to try different samples and eventually I started being able to pick out differences and which ones I liked better. And for me, of course, it was the peated whiskies, so the smoky whiskies that got me started. But it doesn't have to be necessarily for you. I mean, most people usually find the smoky whiskies a little bit more difficult, but if you eat a lot of smoked meats, for example, if you're Scandinavian, we actually tend to like the smoky whiskies a little bit more. And so yeah, it just depends what you're used to. One thing I would say is that bourbon tends to be a little bit of an oakier and sweeter style of whiskey. But then of course if you have Irish, which is triple distilled, meaning that you've distilled it once more than you typically do in Scotland, that extra distillation makes it a little bit smoother. It almost strips away a little bit more of the kind of heavier alcohols that you want to retain in most Scotch. So Irish could be a good one to start with if you're just looking for something a little bit more smooth sometimes. But it of course depends on which Irish it is. Another thing I would recommend is being able to compare whiskies. When you're starting out, it could be that all whiskies just taste the same. They just taste like whiskey. Which is not strange because it does taste like whiskey, but being able to pick out that, oh, this whiskey is a little bit fruitier, this whiskey is a little bit smokier, that whiskey is a little bit more maybe citrus or earthy, all those different kinds of flavor aromas. It's just good to kind of see the differences, and then eventually you'll of course learn which ones you tend to like a bit better. You can of course also start out with trying some different whiskey cocktails. I mean, just swapping your base alcohol for whiskey if you want to try them at home. Or if you go to a whiskey bar and you might say that, oh, I want a whiskey cocktail and I'm just starting out, and maybe you want something fruity or you want something more bitter or savoury or citrusy or sour. So a lot of bartenders are really good with cocktails and they're good at putting flavours together, so that could be another good way of doing it. And of course, if you have the possibility to go to a tasting or perhaps do a virtual tasting, I mean, I'm offering virtual tastings at the moment and I'm so happy to customize the tasting for you if you're looking to get into Scotch whiskey, or if you're looking to get into international whiskies, or you're just looking to get into any whiskies. I mean, leaving it up to someone who knows whiskey, who's gone through the journey already, who can give a lot of information and see what works and what doesn't, and be able to discuss it and ask questions, that's of course a really good way as well. But if you don't have the possibility to do either a virtual tasting or a tasting in person, internet is also your friend. If you try a whiskey that you either like or dislike, being able to learn about why you like them and why you don't like them. So say for example you try a peated whiskey. You try it, you don't like it. But then if you research and you look up, oh, this is peated, then that means that in your whiskey vocabulary, the next time you're having a whiskey or ordering a whiskey, you can say, I don't like peated whiskies. And then they can give you an alternative. Sometimes if you go to a bar and you try different whiskies next to each other, it can of course be a little bit tricky if the people behind the bar don't know their whiskey. But if they do, they can be a really helpful tool. Asking what they think is a good one to start with, for example. If they know one that's a little bit of those kind of flavors you're looking for, or I mean, of course, you can just add a little bit of water or add ice. Because when you're sipping whiskey the first time, instead of shotting it, because you actually miss some of the flavors when you take a shot, because you throw it back on the back of your palate. So the liquid actually doesn't coat your entire palate. But if you're sipping whiskey, I always recommend sipping it, taking a little sip and then trying on the front part of your mouth, like on the tip of your tongue, to be able to actually taste it. Then another good thing, and this is going to sound a little bit disgusting perhaps, but you taste your saliva all the time, and because you're so used to it, it doesn't actually have flavor to you, if that makes sense. So if you're tasting a whiskey and then you kind of mix it around with the saliva in your mouth, then you dilute it naturally without actually adding a flavor to it. Because sometimes if you drink water, water actually has flavor, and adding water to it can change the flavors. Of course in a good way, but if you want it as neutral as possible, just mixing it with a bit of your own saliva actually works. But we're going to move on to talking about water as well. Well, adding water is a great way of doing it. If you taste a whiskey, it might be too strong because the alcohol is a bit difficult to get past. I mean, 40%, which is generally the minimum bottling strength for whiskey, is still quite high. If you're used to drinking wine, which is around 13%-ish, maybe 11, 13, that is such a big jump. So it's starting on something that is 40%, trying it. If you think it's too strong, add a few drops of water. I mean, you can always add more water, but you can never take water out of the whiskey, so I would always recommend adding a little bit and then being able to add more later on. But just tasting the differences, seeing if it gets more approachable for you. The trouble with water is, of course, that if you add water, it can bring up some of the aromas that you really like, but it can also bring up some of the aromas that you don't like. So it's a bit of an experimentation, but that's what's so fun about whiskey. There's so many different ways of trying it and exploring it. And of course, ice is another good one as well. When you cool your whiskey down, you actually kind of lower the taste a little bit. The colder it is, the harder it is to kind of pick up the aromas. And doing that is, of course, making it slightly more approachable if you're not used to whiskey yet. So that can be another good one to do it. Just keep in mind that you can't control the dilution of ice, and if the ice melts quickly, it will of course mean that you have a quicker dilution, so then the aromas will change a lot faster than if you're sitting in maybe a really cold room where the ice is melting slower. But I think my absolute number one tip is to be able to compare it. Getting 3 different whiskies. Say you get a bourbon matured whiskey, you get a sherry matured whiskey, and you get a peated influenced whiskey. Those 3, being able to try them next to each other and pick out different aromas. I mean, go to your kitchen cupboard, smell vanilla, smell cinnamon, smell oak. Just pick up these scents that are around you in your house. And a quick Google away, you can just Google what aromas do you usually find in whiskey. You can find a whole list of them, and then just being able to nose them and being like, this is what cinnamon smells like, and then recognizing them when you find them in whiskey. That's another good way of doing it. It is tricky because everyone's going to be at different levels. Some people are going to be really brilliant at picking out aromas on their nose. It is, of course, also practice makes perfect. Don't be heartbroken if you can't taste anything else than the whiskey flavor or nose anything else than the whiskey flavor. It'll come to you, don't worry. And you can, of course, also try whiskey in a highball, for example, with tonic or just with soda water. If you want something that's a little bit lighter and still lets through some of the flavor of the whiskey. And of course, if you're a wine drinker or a rum drinker or any other kind of spirit, you can also try and find a whiskey that maybe has the influence of that cask and see if you can find similarities or find that character shines through in the whiskey. So say, for example, you have a rum matured whiskey, then they've taken a cask, have held rum, get rid of the rum, then fill that cask with whiskey, and then you will get some of the flavors from the oak, which has previously held that rum, will seep into the whiskey and give it another character. And of course, if you want some recommendation of what to start with, I'm not going to mention any brands in this video here because it is so individual. But for example, if you send me a message, you say that I generally like wine, I don't mind a little bit of an adventurous flavour, or you love fruitiness, or you love citrus sweets, or you love chocolate, just write me a message and I'll try my best to find something to recommend to you. And of course, whiskey doesn't have to be expensive. You can find good whiskies around £30, so don't believe the prices. A higher price doesn't necessarily mean it's a better whiskey. It has to do with other kind of influences as well. And of course, there's some really good websites out there, like for example the Whiskey Exchange and Master Malt, that do these little sample packs. So you can kind of pick and choose your own little samples. I think they're generally 3 cls, so you get a little dram, and then you can do that at home as well. So there's plenty of good alternatives, and if you have a friend who wants to get along as well, even more fun. Perhaps you can compare tasting notes and just have a good chat about your differences and similarities when it comes to what you taste in whiskey. I will of course try my best to do a little bit more videos here on YouTube. For example, what is peat? What is Scotch whiskey? What's the difference between bourbon and Scotch? How does whiskey production work? Just little things that can be quite educational and fun if you're on your way on your whiskey journey. And of course, if there's any questions, feel free to send me an email, put it in the comments, or perhaps send me a message on Instagram and I'll try my best to get back to you as soon as possible. And if there's any subject you would like to see featured soon, also put that in the comments so I know what you would like to see. I have a few ideas of some maybe top 5 budget whiskies in my opinion, and top 5 whiskey cocktails, and just all different things. I love the world of whiskey, and I'm of course a big fan of other flavours as well, so I have so many ideas I want to get out into YouTube, so I'm hoping that the time will allow me to do it as soon as possible. But of course, if you like what I'm doing here on YouTube and my other social channels, I would of course be absolutely over the moon if you consider using my affiliate links with Master Malt, the Whiskey Exchange and the Scotch Malt Whisky Society the next time you're shopping with them. All of that information is of course in the description here below, as well as links to my website, my Patreon, my Teespring shop, and of course, like I said, if you're looking for virtual tastings on how to get introduced to whiskey, and you live in Europe, I do that as well. You can check out the pricing, what's included on my website. But generally it would be a nice little chat, about an hour. I'll talk you through production, I'll talk you through where flavour comes from, and depending on what theme you choose, if you want to stick into Scotch, if you want international whiskies, perhaps comparisons between Irish, Scotch, bourbon and Swedish whiskey for example, then we can do that as well. I have of course worked with inviting people into the world of whiskey and hosting tastings for over 2 years now, and it's one of my passions in life. I love talking to people about whiskey, especially if they're curious to learn more about it. But I hope you've all had an absolutely wonderful day and that you'll enjoy this little video. Slanjava, skål!